Chapter 28. When Delilah left her mother and uncle in the town to fend off the Russians alone, it took every ounce of her strength not to turn back around. She wanted to stay and fight to protect her home, but Delilah also knew that her brother needed someone from their family to survive this fight. While she had all the confidence in the world about her family's capabilities, she was rational enough to understand the odds they faced against the enemy. The Russians outnumbered them. They had more firepower and better training. They might have been able to distract them and put up a good fight, but they were relentless in their battle. Delilah feared her family would be overtaken. Delilah stumbled through the woods, the smoke thickening as she struggled to breathe. She didn't understand how the smoke could be this thick on this side of the river. Not unless the fires had jumped across farther south where Kurt had suggested they might if the wind picked up. If not for the fact that Delilah had traveled these woods for several years when her family came up to the cabin, she would have gotten lost. Still, the thickening smoke made her curious, so she found a nearby tree and climbed. The wind picked up, and Delilah clung onto the branches so to avoid being blown away. She climbed as high as she could go on the oak tree's twisted branches and glanced to the south toward Spokane, where she could go no higher. She couldn't see anything at first. But then, the smoke cleared enough to see the inferno engulfing the city. "Oh my God," Delilah said. The wind gusted hard once more, sending more smoke that masked the fires, but Delilah knew the inferno was on its way. And judging by how quickly the first fires burned, Delilah didn't think they had much time. Delilah quickly descended the trees and landed hard on her heels. She was about to head back to the town to warn her mother when she heard the snap of a branch somewhere in the smoke behind her. Delilah raised her weapon, shifting into a defensive posture as she searched the surrounding smoke. She didn't know if the Russians had already made it past her somehow. Considering how thick the smoke was, it was possible she hadn't seen them move past. But most of the gunfire was still coming from the town behind her. Delilah had her finger on the trigger, ready to fire at a moment's notice. She didn't speak, wanting to remain as still and as silent as possible until she was certain of who stood beyond the smoke. Time passed slowly, and Delilah knew that every second she wasted here was one more where the fires were inching closer to Tuskegee. Delilah decided she couldn't sit and wait anymore, so when she heard more movement to her left, she swiftly engaged with the mysterious figure in the smoke. Delilah always had reasonable control over her trigger finger. It was one of the first things her father had taught her about gun safety. The finger was on the trigger only when you were ready to pull it, and not a moment earlier. It was that training Delilah had, that early instruction from her father that she carried with her even now. And it was the reason it saved Sally Mays' life. Sally jumped when Delilah rushed at her from the smoke. "Mrs. Mays?" Delilah asked. And then she saw the others emerge from the plumes of smoke. It was the entire town, and all of them had some weapons in their hands. "What are you doing?" "We're going to help fight," Sally said. "Your father convinced us to help you. We all went back to our houses after we fled." Delilah saw the frightened yet determined faces of the townsfolk. It was obvious they wanted help, and Delilah believed now that they had a fighting chance to stop the Russians. But with the fires heading their way, time wasn't on their side. "The wildfires have jumped the river," Delilah said, triggering nervous glances. "After we get my mother and uncle, we'll head to the cabin to wait out the fires. Stay with me, stay close, and if you have a gun, make sure you don't shoot until you see your target. We don't want any friendly fire coming from one of our own." Delilah led the charge through the smoke, praying she would reach her mother in time, and the townsfolk followed behind her. Savannah and Kurt crouched close together behind the car. The Russians had increased their amount of gunfire, and it was only a matter of time before they realized Savannah and Kurt had run out of ammunition. "Do you think Luke will make it?" Kurt asked. "He will," Savannah answered. "He doesn't know how to quit." "I hope so," Kurt replied. "I don't want to die for nothing." Savannah thought about that statement for a moment. She had never given any thought to the meaning of her death. She had always assumed that she would die many years from now, peacefully in her sleep after she had watched her grandchildren grow up and maybe even witness the birth of a great-grandchild. But now that the future was in question, she believed that her stand there would at least keep her children's future intact. "We saved people, Kurt," Savannah said. "We helped keep life going. I can't think of a better thing to have fought for than that." Kurt nodded. "I guess you're right." Savannah didn't want to die there, but she found solace in the hope of a future for her children. The shooting stopped, and Savannah figured the Russians were moving in to finish this off. She wished her husband was there with her. Not that she wanted him to die as well, but so she could tell him that she loved him one more time. Savannah decided, though, in the end, that she would not look away. She turned to her left, ready to stand, as she saw one of the Russians moving toward her. They were about to make eye contact when the first gunshot thundered. But it didn't come from the Russians. Savannah watched as the Russian took a bullet to his chest and was flung backward. Savannah frowned, and then, through the smoke of the alleyway, she saw her daughter rush forward, gun up and armed, flanked by the rest of the town. "Move! Move now!" Delilah shouted. Savannah didn't linger, rushing forward with Kurt as Delilah and the rest of the town provided cover fire for their retreat. "Mom!" Delilah said, rushing over. "We must get everyone to the cabin as quickly as possible." "We need to take these guys out now," Savannah shouted. "The fire's made it across the river," Delilah said. "It's heading this way." Savannah had suspected that given the thickening smoke, it might be happening, but she wasn't sure how much time they had. "We need to go. It's coming now," Delilah said. "Come on, everyone, get back!" Savannah fell in line with her daughter, rushing through the smoke as they sprinted toward the cabin, keeping the Russians back at a good clip. As they neared the cabin, everyone heard the roar of the fires growing closer. Savannah had never heard anything like it before in her life. It sounded like 10,000 freight trains were heading toward them. It was so loud that her body vibrated from the noise. Savannah and the rest of the town stumbled over the forest terrain, the wind picking up and blinding them with smoke. The gunfire eventually stopped, and everyone shifted into a sprint and focused on getting to the cabin. It wasn't about outrunning the Russians anymore. It was about outrunning the fires. "Keep going!" Delilah shouted. Savannah knew they were close, but when she looked behind her, she couldn't see the Russians anymore. She wasn't sure if they were still following her, but she could see the glow of the fires coming from the south. The fires had crossed the river. When they reached the cabin, they headed for the front door, and Savannah was the first one there. She ripped in the door, screaming for Lenny, who came rushing toward the front. "Mom!" Lenny shouted and collided with her legs. "Get down into the basement, now!" Savannah shouted. Everyone flooded into the cabin, with Savannah keeping the door open. She didn't look at the faces that passed because she was only concentrated on finding two, Kurt and Delilah. Kurt was the last face to pass through, and Savannah stopped him when he didn't see Delilah. "Where's Dee?" Savannah asked. "I thought she was ahead of us," Kurt asked. Their questions were answered when they heard gunshots coming from the front of the property. And through the smoke, Savannah and Kurt saw Delilah shooting at the Russians and keeping them from getting close. "Delilah!" Savannah shouted. "Fall back, now!" Delilah turned and started running, the Russians chasing her. But now that the Russians had stumbled onto their property, it was Savannah's turn to show them what happened when they messed with the wrong people. They had installed security measures throughout the property, one of which was an explosive system in the event of a large force attempting to take over. Once Delilah was out of the blast zone, Savannah opened a panel in the front wall near the door and flipped 3 switches, triggering a fiery explosion near the woods of the property, just as the Russians reached the property line. The noise of the fire dwarfed the blast of the explosion, and Savannah didn't have time to celebrate the victory as Delilah rushed inside. "Get down to the basement, now!" Savannah shouted. Kurt and Delilah headed toward the basement, and Savannah opened another panel to initiate the sprinkler and water system around the house. She hoped it would help repel the fires. And given the distance between the house and the fire line, she thought it would hold. Savannah then quickly joined the others down below, sealing themselves underground. They had a built-in ventilation system with 3 stages of filters to ensure they didn't choke to death down below. When Savannah closed the latch above the basement, she prayed the house survived the fires, and hoped that her husband did too. Chapter 29. Luke twisted the handle on the hatch door, making sure it was sealed tight and the Russians couldn't get them from above. Kevin was already moving quickly down the ladder, and Luke followed his lead. The Russians tried breaking into the thick steel door from above, but couldn't get through. After they had given up, Luke was already halfway down the ladder, and he finally took time to glance around. He saw the nuclear missile barely 20 feet away. It was taller, but skinnier than he imagined. When they reached the bottom, Kevin moved to a nearby door and stood on the right side while Luke huddled on the left. "The control room is inside," Kevin said. "I'm guessing the Russians topside have already alerted the guns down here. So when we open that door, we go in with guns up, got it?" Luke nodded, too jacked up on adrenaline to formulate any words. "You follow my lead, okay? I've cleared close quarters like this before. And all I need from you is to make sure no one shoots me in the back," Kevin said. "Got it," Luke replied. Kevin took in a breath, and Luke tried to steady his hands as Kevin reached for the door handle and pulled it open. Luke stepped through the door, following Kevin, and accidentally bumped into Kevin when he stopped. Then Kevin slapped Luke's shoulder and pointed ahead. There was an open door on the left, and then there was a long hallway with an inclined ramp straight ahead, which Luke assumed would lead to the silo's main entrance and the bunker up top where the Russians were located. As Luke heard the steady thump of boots in the tunnel, it was obvious the Russians were heading down. "Hold that position," Kevin said, pointing to the tunnel. "You don't let them get down here, understand?" Luke nodded, and as Kevin moved toward the control room, Luke positioned himself in the corner at the end of the tunnel. He couldn't see the Russians yet, but he heard them. Even when they were within his line of sight, he waited. From what Luke could see, there were no doors in the tunnel down to the silo's control room. That meant if Luke could wait for the Russians to get toward the middle, they'd have nowhere to run and be a sitting duck for him. When the Russians crossed the halfway mark, Luke stepped around the corner and opened fire. The Russians were immediately caught off guard, and Luke managed to strike 2 before the others returned fire. The gunshots boomed with thunder and fury in the echoing halls. And when Kevin finally broke into the control room, the gunfire behind Luke grew intense as well. Luke fired 2 more shots, keeping the Russians at a reasonable distance before he glanced back to check on Kevin's progress. Kevin had already made it inside, and after the first round of intense gunfire, everything quieted down. Luke didn't know how many Russians were in the control room, but there was lots of shouting. And Luke figured Kevin was trying to get them to shut down the missile launch. But Luke had other problems to deal with as the Russians in the tunnel had made another sprint forward. Luke managed to take out 2 of them, but the last Russian reached Luke before he could pull the trigger. The Russian knocked the rifle out of Luke's hand and then brandished a pistol, but Luke quickly countered it by lunging forward and grabbing a hold of the Russian's wrist, twisting it hard into the left as the man squeezed the trigger. Luke twisted harder, and the gun dropped. He then lunged forward for the Russian's throat, but when he grabbed hold to squeeze, the Russian leaned back, drawing a knife and slashing it across the arm Luke used to reach for the Russian's throat, and then stumbled back. The pair stayed separated by about 6 feet for a few moments, each sizing the other up. Luke understood that he was the underdog in this fight. The Russian before him looked like a man who had spent his life in the military. He had training, and while Luke knew how to fight, he believed the Russian had no doubt killed before. With Kevin still preoccupied and the enemy in the control room, Luke had to stand and fight the man alone. Luke recalled everything he knew about fighting to face his opponent. He controlled the distance between himself and the Russian, but the Russian was quick, jutting in from the sides and head-on a few times, slashing the knife wildly in his hands. Luke worked around the small cove at the end of the tunnel, looking for any opening to bring the Russian down. But the Russian was too experienced. He sensed what Luke was trying to do and rushed forward, forcing Luke back against the wall where he pinned him up. Luke focused on stopping the knife, making sure the Russian couldn't plunge it into his neck or slice up the veins running along his legs. But it took both arms to keep the Russian back, and the Russian continued to beat and smash against Luke, weakening him with body shots. Every blow knocked the wind from Luke's lungs, but he held onto the blade, knowing that if he let go, he would die. The Russian doubled down on the heavy blows, striking Luke repeatedly until there was an unmistakable crack of a bone in his ribs. The pain in Luke's ribs caused his arms to buckle, and then the knife came down, but just before it went into Luke's chest, he sidestepped to the right, stumbling away from the Russian's path. But the Russian smelled blood in the water. He chased Luke down, aggressively attacking him, knowing he was close to the kill. However, with the Russian so focused on Luke, the man was blind to everything else. Luke saw the gun in his peripheral, the one that had dropped when the Russian had first attacked. Luke worked his way back around. When he was in position, he reached for the weapon and aimed at the Russian, who was now too exposed to hide, and pulled the trigger 4 times. Each round pumped into the Russian caused his body to jerk, but after the 4th round entered his body, he dropped to the floor. Luke was hunched forward, favoring the side where he'd broken his ribs, and stared at the dead Russian. Luke walked over and kicked the knife away, keeping the gun aimed at him. The Russian's eyes were still open, but stared blankly at the ceiling. There was no more focus or life in that man. There was more shouting in the main operating room, and Luke hobbled over to see what was happening. He entered and saw one dead Russian and another on his knee, with Kevin aiming a gun at his face. "Where's the launch key?" Kevin shouted. The Russian said nothing, staring at Kevin with a resolve that refused to break. Luke walked up next to Kevin, struggling to breathe. "Did you stop it?" Luke asked. "The control board is shut down, but I can't find the key for the launch," Kevin said. "Well, it might be on one of the dead guys, right?" Luke asked. "The key isn't a physical key. It's a code sequence," Kevin answered. "The Russians changed it to something else, and I don't know if that means they've already started the countdown clock." "If the control panel is shut down, what matters?" Luke asked. "It matters because the control panel only handles the launch," Kevin answered. "If the nuke has been programmed to detonate, then it'll blow up right here in this silo." Luke immediately thought of his family. If they couldn't stop the nuke from exploding, then it didn't matter where they went. "We need to find out who has it," Kevin said, then looked at Luke. "You don't have to stay for this if you can't stomach it." At first, Luke didn't understand what Kevin was trying to tell him. And then, it hit him all at once. Kevin would torture the Russian to get the information out of him. And while Luke didn't feel sorry for the Russian because this was the man's chosen life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to see the methods used. "Do you need me to stay?" Luke asked, offering his help before he made his final decision. "No," Kevin answered. And then he forced the Russian onto the ground and clamped a zip tie to his wrists. Luke stepped out of the control room and saw the dead Russian from earlier. He then walked up to the tunnel and saw the dead Russians there as well. All men that he had killed. He felt like he was buried with these men, locked in a concrete coffin. Luke wanted to make sure there weren't any more surprises, so he walked up the tunnel, staring at the dead men as he passed, to make sure there weren't any more Russians topside. He reached the spiral staircase and started to make his way up to the top. But as he neared the surface, he heard something beyond the walls of the concrete bunker that capped the silo. It sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. But as Luke reached for the heavy steel door, the moment his finger touched it, it burned his skin. He stepped back, frowning, and then leaned closer to the door, listening to the sounds outside. It was clear what was happening, but he needed to see it for himself. Luke removed his shirt and wrapped the cloth around his hands. He then grabbed the steel door and pulled it open as smoke seeped through the open cracks. Because the fires were so intense, he didn't need to keep the door open for long, and he quickly sealed it shut again, coughing as he descended the steps to escape the acrid smoke. When Luke reached the bottom of the staircase again, he glanced up at the smoke still clouding the top. The fires had crossed the river, and all Luke thought about was his family. But the cabin was prepared for something like that. They had taken the precautions in case of a wildfire. Still, Luke couldn't shake the worry from his mind. It clung to him, forcing him to imagine his family trapped out there, burning to ash. The situation was overwhelming. He was trapped down in this silo, buried with the dead, and his family was fighting something even more dangerous topside. When the Russian in the control room started screaming, Luke shook the buried thought from his mind. No, he wasn't buried. Between the fires and the screaming, he had already gone to hell. Chapter 20. The basement was quiet, save for the hum of the water pump running down below, ensuring water was continuously sprayed over the house to prevent it from catching fire. Delilah was near the front of the basement with the rest of her family, along with Sammy and Tiffany. Neither of the girls had said a word, but Delilah noticed how Tiffany couldn't stop shaking. Delilah didn't blame her. It was a terrifying situation. Tiffany had never been someone Delilah considered a good friend. If anything, she'd always been a bit of a bully. But the girl's fear was genuine, and Delilah was a firm believer in second chances. "Hey," Delilah said, gently touching Tiffany's shoulder. Tiffany shuddered. Her anxiety dialed up to 10. She was no longer the confident, mean girl Delilah saw in school daily. "We're going to be all right," Delilah said. Tiffany shook her head. "I'm not afraid for me. If the fires made the jump, then I don't know what happened to my family." Delilah had forgotten that Tiffany's family was still in the city, and now that city was on fire. But unlike the EMP, they would have been able to see the fires coming. "It's no use worrying about something you have no control over," Delilah answered. "Easier said than done," Tiffany replied. "I guess that's true," Delilah said. "They probably didn't even realize I was gone," Tiffany said. "My family isn't like yours. They don't look out for one another. It's a dog-eat-dog mentality. My father says it's how a child builds character." "That's awful," Sammy said, overhearing the conversation. Tiffany shrugged. "You get used to it. I think that's why." She drew in a breath. "I think that's why I'm such a pain in the ass." Delilah laughed, and Tiffany cracked a smile. "See?" Tiffany asked. "I knew you didn't like me." "Yeah, because you're a pain in the ass," Delilah said, and she playfully punched Tiffany in the arm. Tiffany relaxed a little after that. But then, the steady hum of the water pump shut off, and the silence in the basement was deafening. Delilah looked over to her mother, who hurried over to the machine. She tried messing with it, and when nothing worked, Uncle Kurt joined her. The pair remained huddled over the machine, and while Delilah couldn't hear their whispers, something was clearly wrong. Delilah pushed through the bodies and joined her mother and uncle near the pump. "What's going on with the pump?" Delilah asked. "We don't know," Kurt answered. "I think a breaker flipped," Savannah said. "Where's the box?" Kurt asked. "Outside," Savannah answered. "Right," Kurt replied. "Okay, I'll run up there and turn it back on." Kurt headed for the stairs, but Savannah stopped him. "It's too dangerous to head up there with the fires," Savannah said. "You might not even be able to find it." "And what does that mean for the rest of us?" Kurt asked. "What happens if there's no water running across the house?" Delilah knew, but her mother was hesitant to speak it aloud. However, before anyone could say anything, they heard footsteps hurrying up the staircase. Delilah turned to see Lenny sprinting up the stairs. "Lenny, no!" Delilah shouted. "I want to help. I can do this!" Lenny shouted. Kurt and Savannah bounded up the stairs, Delilah close behind. Lenny had a head start, and he was faster than he looked. Delilah followed her mother and uncle through the house, which was filled with smoke from the open door, and the three of them barreled outside. The fires were close, and the thick smoke blinded them and choked them the moment they were outside. They all screamed for Lenny, but the raging fires dwarfed their voices. Delilah stood near the house, afraid to go any farther. She had seen firsthand what these fires could do, and had barely survived the fires the first time. But when Delilah thought of her brother, when she thought of him out there in the smoke, the wind, and the fires, she pushed her fear aside and stepped away from the house. "Lenny!" Delilah yelled at the top of her lungs, but the wind and fire's roar swallowed her voice. Delilah squinted through the smoke and saw the amber glow of the fires surrounding the house. She stumbled around, spinning in circles, lost even though she had only walked a few feet away. The smoke was growing worse, and she struggled to breathe. She collapsed to her knees, unable to move any farther. She thought she was going to die outside, but she hoped she would pass out before the fires got her. Delilah was about to collapse forward when a hand shot out through the smoke and grabbed hold of her, yanking her off her knees. Delilah didn't resist the hand, coughing and hacking as she was pulled back toward the house. She was vaguely aware of being sprayed with water before she was pulled inside and back down to the basement. It wasn't until Delilah was down the stairs that she could finally stop and catch her breath. She coughed so hard she threw up, but managed to reach for a nearby bucket in time before it hit the floor. Delilah finally looked up through tear-streaked eyes and saw her mother and uncle with Lenny between them. "You found him?" Delilah asked. Lenny was still and quiet as he held on to his mother. "I just wanted to help." "Thanks," Delilah said, looking at her uncle, "for pulling me out." "That wasn't me," Kurt said, and then he gestured toward the bottom of the stairs behind Delilah, where Tiffany sat, her head down and catching her breath. Delilah was shocked that Tiffany had gone out and grabbed her. Out of all the questions that swirled through her mind, there was only one she managed to speak aloud. "Why?" Delilah asked. Because I don't want to be a pain in the ass anymore," Tiffany said. Delilah smiled, and Tiffany returned the smirk as they all waited to see if the house had survived the fires. Chapter 31. The basement was dark and cramped, but everyone was too worried about the fires to notice him. It never ceased to amaze Mark how quickly people discarded essential details when they needed to survive. The moment Mark saw those people show up and attack the guards who were looking after the hostages, he understood what was at stake. He knew how to fight, but that wasn't his most valuable skill. It was blending in. Mark had discarded his weapon, save for the pistol tucked under his pant leg, and all his other gear, as he slipped into the herd of the retreating townsfolk. He kept quiet, kept to himself, kept in the back. People were sniffling and crying, but Mark remained silent. But through the heads of townspeople, he saw the woman who owned the house. She was with another man and a younger girl. The trio of them had killed many of his comrades. It would have been easy to kill them all in this tiny basement. Everyone was too tired and too scared to stop him. But Mark understood that these people were not the mission. And because he had yet to hear the missile's explosion, he knew the weapon had not been fired. The other attackers might have overwhelmed his comrades, and if that was the case, he was the last one standing. He would not let them down. He would succeed in his mission. All he had to do was think of his uncle and the promises he had made. He thought of his father's murder and his mother's slow death. Mark held on to that anger for a long time, let it simmer and boil him down to the essential components required to finish the task. He was the last member of the Red Guard and would not fall. But after he launched the missile, after he accomplished his mission and sent the nuclear warhead to the heart of this bastard nation, he would kill those three and the 2 men who had attacked the bunker and murdered his comrades. He would make them all suffer. He would make sure they all understood what happened when they crossed him. It was then that Mark would unleash his anger, his hate, and the pent-up rage that had laid dormant for so many years. His time was coming. His revenge would be cruel and violent. Chapter 32. Even after Luke had walked to the end of the tunnel, he still heard the Russians' screams as Kevin did whatever he could to extract information. Luke wasn't sure how effective Kevin's strategy was, but the world of interrogation was not his forte. Luke reached the spiral staircase that curved to the top of the silo like a corkscrew. He stared up at it, wondering how many times people had come down here when the silo was being built, and wondered how the end of the world would play out. Luke figured that most people who had worked to build this place had really considered its consequences. This had been a job for someone, nothing more and nothing less. And now, dangerous people had killed many others to use this place for evil. Luke placed his foot on the first step of the staircase, and his boot made a dull thud against the rusted steel. It amazed him that something like this was nestled in the back of the community they had come to love so much. And now, that community's future was threatened. Everyone's future was threatened. A single gunshot echoed from the other end of the tunnel, and Luke flinched, reaching for his rifle as he aimed it down the tunnel. But Luke lowered it when he watched Kevin slowly walk the incline up the staircase. He was wiping blood off his hands with a rag. "They were still trying to get the site operational," Kevin said. "The EMP messed with some of the equipment they hadn't anticipated. The launch sequence hasn't been started." Luke nodded. "Hey, this is good news," Kevin said. "We did it." "The fires jumped across the river," Luke said. "I don't know if they're still burning, but we're trapped down here until they stop." Kevin glanced up the staircase to see if Luke was telling the truth. "How long do you think it's going to burn?" "Depends," Luke answered. "We can check again in a little bit." The pair didn't speak after that. Kevin sat down on the third step of the staircase, and Luke remained standing as he leaned against the smooth concrete of the wall. It was odd to be cold down below, with the fires raging above. Luke stared at the bodies of the Russians still in the hallway. "How did they get here?" "You'd be surprised at how much human trafficking happens in our own country," Kevin said. "It's not as hard to smuggle people inside as you'd think. But given the condition of the first man I found who was a part of this group, I'd say that most of them had moved here a while ago from Russia legally, and then built their reputations from there." "They've been living here the whole time?" Luke asked. "Most likely," Kevin answered. "During the height of the Cold War, spies on both sides had embedded themselves so deep in an enemy's country that after the Cold War was over, many of them stayed where they were. They'd built a life around their mission, and to leave after decades of living that lie seemed pointless." Luke couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The foundation of his life was built on a lie. "I don't know how you people do it." "You'd be surprised at what people can do when angry enough," Kevin said. Luke wasn't surprised. All he had to think about was his experience with Buford Tannen, the man willing to kill to get what he wanted. It was the kind of selfishness and greed that Luke hated, and he suspected that the Russians who came here had their own brand of selflessness in the form of revenge. Luke and Kevin remained near the stairs for a while, the time passing incredibly slowly. It wasn't until neither of them could take the silence anymore that Kevin walked up the staircase, and Luke followed. It still smelled of smoke at the top, but when Luke pressed his hand against the steel door, it was only warm to the touch, not boiling like before. "I think it might be all right," Luke said, and he and Kevin pulled on the heavy steel door. A gust of smoke and ash was pushed inside the silo from the wind. Luke turned away as the dust blasted him, and when he faced the open door, he saw a world transformed. The camp the Russians had made was burned to the ground. The bodies of the remains were charred to a blackened crisp, their clothes melted to their bodies in some places. The trees were stripped of vegetation. The ferns, shrubs, and grass were gone, replaced by a blanket of ash and dust. Smoke filtered through the air, and even though the nuclear missile was still in the bunker behind them, the landscape looked like the bomb had already gone off. But the fires had stopped, and Luke couldn't sit around and wait any longer to go find his family. Without another word to Kevin, Luke broke into a jog and moved through the wasteland of forest on his way to the cabin. He heard Kevin following him, calling out, but Luke didn't respond. There were too many questions running through his mind, too many unknowns, and until he was sure of his family's survival, Luke was focused solely on the mission. Some buildings were still on fire when Luke passed Tuskegee's Main Street. Luke wasn't sure if the fire itself had died out, or if it was still marching east. Given the considerable amount of smoke moving through the area, he figured the fires were still raging, but whether they had claimed the lives of his family, he wasn't sure. Luke pushed through the forest, weaving around the blackened trunks between Tuskegee's Main Street and his cabin. The deeper he moved through the smoking woods, the more bodies he saw on the ground. At first, Luke feared the townspeople hadn't made it. But as he got closer to the remains, he saw the weapons and combat gear that belonged to the Russians. The bodies were sprinkled around the cabin, but as he moved closer to his home, he saw that it was still standing. The clearing where Luke had built the cabin had not succumbed to the fires that ravaged the rest of the forest. The water pipes had burst around the house and the surrounding area, causing water to bubble up from the ground, but the house was still standing. Luke knew his family would have entered the basement, and he burst inside the house, heading toward the basement stairs. When he opened the door, calling out his wife's name, he froze when he looked down the staircase. Savannah was at the bottom, looking up at him with tears. "Thank God," Luke said. Savannah sprinted up the stairs and wrapped Luke in her arms. Delilah and Lenny soon followed, and the four held on to one another at the top of the stairs in a wordless embrace. "Did everyone make it?" Luke asked when the hug finally ended. "Yes, we got everyone down below," Savannah said. "Even me," Kurt said, walking up in front of the group that followed him from the basement below. Luke hugged his brother, and the emotional moment caused both men to shed a tear. They all stepped aside and allowed the rest of the townsfolk who needed shelter to come up. They packed together in small groups, and the cabin was too small to fit everyone, so they spilled outside. Everyone was in awe of the carnage the fires had created. They all stood around, gawking. Everything they had ever known was burned to the ground, destroyed. Their lives completely upended. These people had nothing. "You should say something," Savannah said. Luke had never been one for speeches, but the people were hurting. And considering his house was the only one left standing, Luke felt duty-bound to say something. "You're alive," Luke said, catching everyone's attention. "I know that might not sound like much right now, but it's the most important thing. Everything the fires destroyed and what was lost can be rebuilt. My family and I will do whatever we can to help, but the most important thing we can do right now is band together." The crowd leaned into Luke now, hanging on his words. The faces staring back at Luke were hungry for guidance, for a sense of hope. "Every single one of you can help make this community the place it was before," Luke said. "It will take time. It will take enormous amounts of effort, efforts that are beyond a single person, but together, we can make this place our home again." While everyone focused on Luke's speech, Kevin studied the crowd's faces. He couldn't imagine what it was like to have your life completely burned to the ground. These people's lives were completely turned upside down. But while most of the crowd was glued to Luke's words, Kevin noticed a man among them, situated in the back. The man wore a hat and kept his head down, staring at his feet. He looked familiar to Kevin, but that seemed impossible, considering he just met these people. The longer Kevin stared at the man, the more confident he was that he'd seen him somewhere else. He slowly circled to the back of the crowd to get a better look at the man, and when Kevin stepped around the last row of people, the man in the hat looked up. And Kevin saw the same pair of ice-blue eyes of the Russian who had killed his partner in Montana. Before Kevin could pull his gun, however, Mark already had his pistol out, and he shot Kevin. The crowd screamed, and Mark sprinted into the woods as Kevin hit the ground. There wasn't any pain at first, but then he was suddenly cold. There was shouting and screaming, and then someone was beside him. But all Kevin could think about was what Mark would do as he sprinted back in the direction of the silo. Chapter 33. The gunshot made everyone duck and scatter. Luke still had his rifle and pushed through the crowd toward the noise. He saw a man sprinting through the blackened, smoky forest when he came out on the other side. Luke raised his rifle to fire and squeezed the trigger, but the man vanished into the smoke. He fired several times, hoping to get lucky, but then he heard Savannah screaming for the first aid kit. Luke spun around and saw Kevin on the ground, a gunshot wound to his upper left chest. He was bleeding a lot, and his face was pale. He rushed over to the Homeland Security agent to help save his life, but Kevin grabbed Luke's shirt and pulled him closer.
"It's him,"
Kevin said breathlessly.
"He's going back to the silo. You have to stop him."
Luke glanced back at the smoke where the enemy had vanished. He understood what was at stake now.
"I'll be back,"
Luke said.
"Keep him alive. Do whatever you can."
"I'm not letting you go alone," Savannah said.
"You need to help him,"
Luke said.
"I'll take Kurt with me."
Kurt had already gone inside and grabbed a weapon, but Sally Mays walked over and started to help dress Kevin's wounds. "I was trained in first aid, so I can help," Sally said, gesturing to Luke and Kurt. "Go with them." Savannah stood up and then quickly retrieved the weapon. Delilah also came out and was ready to fight. Luke stopped her, but she was prepared for it. "Don't give me that I have to stay behind for my family crap," Delilah said. "If we don't stop that guy from blowing up the world, then we won't have anything left."
"I understand. But if we fail?"
"We won't fail if we work together." "You taught me that, Dad," Delilah said. Luke couldn't help but smile at how his daughter had been able to turn those words against him. She had been listening better than he had anticipated.
"That's true,"
Luke said. And then he placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, speaking to her softly, the way he always did when he told her something important.
"But you're my responsibility. And I can't let you put yourself in harm's way, Delilah. You're my daughter. This is not your fight."
"But it is, Dad," Delilah said. "I have just as much to lose as you do."
Luke smiled. "You'll understand when you have a child of your own one day."
There was no further discussion on the matter, and Luke, Savannah, and Kurt left the group of townspeople to save Kevin's life. The trio sprinted through the wasteland that was the forest, moving as quickly as their tired bodies could go. Luke stayed on the lookout for the Russian in case he had set any traps waiting, but by the time they passed the main street and found nothing, Luke believed the path was clear. They passed the graveyard of Russians and the 2 Humvees that Savannah and the others had taken out during their initial attack. The bodies of the dead Russians were burned to a crisp like the surrounding woods. But the Humvees themselves looked like they had survived the brunt of the fires. When they reached the bunker again, Luke slowly approached the front door. It was sealed shut and locked from the inside. Kurt banged on the steel door a few times, but his brother's efforts were futile.
"He's already inside,"
Luke said,
He's locked himself in there nice and tight.
So what do we do? Savannah asked.
There might be another way,
Luke said, heading over to the hatch door he and Kevin had gone through before. Luke tried to open the hatch, but it wouldn't budge. It was still locked from their previous descent. He considered shooting it, but his rifle wasn't powerful enough to take apart the heavy steel of even the small hatch door. How are we supposed to get inside? Savannah asked. Luke kicked himself for not bringing more weapons. But then, he remembered the Humvees and looked at his wife.
Follow me,
Luke said, and he jogged into the woods, heading east the way they'd come. He turned around and called for his brother to follow him as well. Luke backtracked until he found the Humvees again and moved toward the big guns mounted on top.
You think one of those will be able to tear through that door?
Luke asked.
Worth a shot to find out,
Kurt answered. Luke and Kurt headed for the Humvee on its side, but Savannah stopped them. Check the other one, Savannah answered. That one used all the ammo. Luke and Kurt then hurried over to the other vehicle and climbed up. It took some work to bring the gun down, but they managed to lower it and found one box of ammunition that had survived the fires. Luke called out for Savannah, but she remained near the front of the Humvee, which was on its side. She stared down at something, and then Luke jogged over to her and saw the body on the ground. It's Floyd, Savannah said. It took Luke a moment to remember the name. But then, he remembered the older man who'd shown up with Kevin in the truck. He saved my life, Savannah said. And then those people shot and killed him like it was nothing. The fires had made Floyd's body unrecognizable because of the flames. Luke gently touched Savannah's shoulder.
We need to go,
Luke said. Savannah nodded. Thank you, Floyd. Luke had every intention of burying the dead they'd lost, but right now, they needed to break into the silo. Kurt and Luke carried the giant gun back to the front entrance of the silo, while Savannah brought the ammunition. It took them a minute to figure out how to feed the ammunition into the big gun, but once they did, it was Luke who was behind the big weapon, and Kurt stood nearby to help keep Luke steady.
Aim for the lock,
Kurt said.
That should make it easier to open once that's busted.
Luke braced himself, and then put his finger on the trigger. The gun kicked back into Luke's chest so hard that he was knocked to the ground. Luke struggled to breathe, but when he got to his feet, he saw the damage the single bullet had done to the heavy door. There was a significant tear in the old steel, and Luke returned behind his weapon to put himself in a better stance.
Okay, take two,
Luke said. Luke squeezed the trigger again. This time, when the gun kicked back, he was ready for it. He kept the weapon steady enough to concentrate fire on the steel door. And Luke didn't take his finger off the trigger until they'd gone through the entire ammunition box. When it was finished, Luke's entire body trembled from the effort it took to hold the big gun steady. He tossed the big gun to the side, and then approached what remained of the steel door. The bullets had torn entirely through the locking mechanism, and while Luke and Kurt had to pull to get it back, they managed to open it enough to squeeze through the entrance. Once everyone was through, they stared down the staircase.
Stay sharp,
Luke said, and he was the first one down the staircase, hoping to find the Russian before he started World War III.